July 2016 brings us to the third and final, at least for now, limited run release from Mighty Rabbit Studios, Breach and Clear Deadline. As the name suggests, Deadline followed on from the concepts and mechanics of the original Breach and Clear, but anyone expecting another traditional take on the military strategy genre here is in for a surprise. Deadline mixes things up from its predecessor in several significant ways, the most obvious, though perhaps not the most meaningful, being the change in focus from military tactics set in modern combat theaters to fighting back waves of undead monsters in a post-apocalyptic hellscape. It would be easy to shrug off this creative change as anything but creative. After all, any military-themed property seems like it will inevitably stumble into the zombie genre at some point. Given the original Breach and Clear's loose connections to the Call of Duty series, it would almost seem like this series was fated to follow in Infinity Ward's footsteps and end up grappling with the undead as well. Sure, Deadline calls the monsters the infected rather than zombies, and the gimmick here is that the mindless walkers are driven by rapidly evolving parasitic worms, but a zombie is a zombie no matter how you ooze it. But if Deadline's premise feels like video game business as usual, its execution is anything but. The original Breach and Clear was strictly a turn-based, mission-by-mission tactical combat simulation in the XCOM vein. Deadline is decidedly not. Mighty Rabbit Studios radically overhauled the Breach and Clear game engine to break away from the original's rigid mission-based format, and also to break away from the original game's exclusively turn-based combat cycles. Deadline plays out as a hybrid work that blurs the line between genres. It allows players to freely switch between turn-based and real-time play, even as it combines tactical combat with open-world dungeon crawling. Where the original Breach and Clear can trace its design origins back to games like XCOM, Deadline has more in common with the Fallout and Wasteland games. Players control a 4-man squad of soldiers, just like in the first game, but the player's relationship with the team is very different this time around. When combat begins, you still direct your team members around the battlefield, attempting to guide them to tactically advantageous positions while under fire. With each turn, your team members can stand their ground, rush to a new point of cover, or advance with caution while laying down suppressing fire toward the enemy. Each of your soldiers can specialize in one of 6 different categories, ranging from lightly armed scouts to durable fire team commanders. These specialties each have their own unique skill tree, and players unlock new abilities by gaining experience levels in combat. At the same time, you can invest resources into leveling up your weapons. Raw materials can enhance weapon strength, while incorporating add-on components grant you access to new weapon capabilities. And each combat class can deploy different consumable tools and weapons during battle, be it lobbing flashbangs or resuscitating a casualty under fire. No surprises here, all of this is carried over more or less directly from the first Breach and Clear. Where things take a swerve for the unexpected is in the way these familiar elements combine with new additions and new ways to play. While you can approach combat and Deadline by the first game's rules, you don't have to. At any time, you can toggle between turn-based and real-time combat with the press of a shoulder button, essentially turning the entire game into a squad-based, third-person shooter complete with a free camera system and guns mapped to the shoulder triggers. On top of that, you don't always have to issue orders to your team members individually. By tapping the square button, you can order your team to form up as a group and move in tandem. Taking on a horde of zombies simultaneously as a team in real time makes for a very different play experience than the one offered by the original Breach and Clear, despite this being very much a direct descendant of that game. Even avoiding the real-time switch to take a pure turn-based approach in Deadline ends up playing out more fluidly than it did in the original game. Rather than dividing up combat sequences into segmented turns, Deadline treats time as a fluid, continuous thing. When you designate a position and action for a unit, that soldier doesn't simply move to comply in a single turn before time comes to a halt. Instead, each fighter treats directions as more of a command to be carried out until you say otherwise. Orders can be given to different units out of sync with one another, meaning you can place one soldier on a continuous overwatch and leave him there indefinitely, while directing the others to perform a number of different consecutive actions under his protection. The key to combat here is the R2 trigger, which advances time when pressed. Hold down the trigger and actions by all combatants play out in real time. Let up on the trigger and the action freezes. The harder you press the analog trigger, the faster events unspool. This gives players intuitive and complete control over the battlefield, allowing them to watch their commands play out and see the enemy's counter tactics. You're free to pan the camera around to focus in on specific details or skirmishes as needed while the action plays out, then pause the order of time in order to issue new commands or beat a hasty retreat if things start to go sour. Deadline's more dynamic approach to combat flow isn't simply a neat feature, it's a basic necessity that emerges from the dramatic new enemies the game introduces. The soldiers and terrorists who populated the world of Breach and Clear fought according to the standard rules of combat, observing careful tactics and prioritizing self-preservation above offensive ferocity. Not so the infected of Deadline. As mindless zombies, they advance upon the player's team in waves, heedless of their own well-being, aiming to destroy your 4-man squad with the crush of sheer numbers. Breach and Clear was about finding safe cover while angling for a clear shot at foes who had bunkered down for safety. Deadline, on the other hand, forces you to play more reactively than tactically at times. While some zombies have ranged attacks, many times you'll find that sticking to cover is less critical than giving your team clear lines of sight so they can take out mobs of monsters, then backpedal for safety as needed. Which isn't to say the need for more traditional military tactics no longer exists in Deadline. Your team crash lands in a zombie apocalypse urban hellscape, after all, and that means you inevitably have to contend with roaming packs of human mercenaries and looters, along with the undead. Your living opponents in Deadline don't make use of mindless zombie tactics, preferring instead to find their own cover and exchange fire with you on equal terms. Well, usually. Certain zombies have the ability to revive fallen opponents and create entirely new threats, so battlefields where you face off against both the living and the undead can be incredibly stressful. Not only do you have to deal with aggressive zombies and cunning humans, the latter can also become the former unless you take heed of that all-time classic bit of advice: burn it with fire. Time isn't the only thing that flows continuously in Deadline. So does the game world. Once your team crashes into the remains of Harbor City, that's where you're stuck for the remainder of the adventure. But Harbor City isn't made up of a series of separate, standalone maps that need to be cleared of foes one after the other. Rather, the entire city is a sprawling, interconnected entity. Any plaza, street, parking lot, or public park can transform into a battlefield without warning, as zombies or other marauders stumble across your fire team. Likewise, any building you can enter is likely to be occupied by armed forces who have no desire to share their space. Combat encounters are hemmed in by arbitrary perimeter boundaries that your team can't pass until all threats have been put down. But those hazards are less rigidly defined than in the original Breach and Clear. While traveling around the city, you may encounter a handful of enemies from time to time outside of larger battle sequences, and your team's stamina and equipment carries over from encounter to encounter, creating a real sense of tension and attrition as you wander even further away from home base, which is where you go to heal up, stock up, and take on side quests. Nursing a wounded team around the city only to discover a mob of undead between you and base is a harrowing experience with no equivalent in the original Breach and Clear. While Mighty Rabbit released Deadline digitally on multiple platforms including Steam, mobile, and Xbox One, the limited run physical release shipped exclusively for PlayStation 4 as catalog number 14. Also released along the PS4 disc were physical editions of Jason Greaves' game soundtrack, available on both compact disc and an extremely limited LP version pressed on red vinyl. A few weeks after Deadline, a third game arrived from East Asia Soft. Like Deadline, Rainbow Moon for PlayStation 4 and Vita involves hybrid role-playing and tactical gameplay, though unlike Deadline, it's a far more traditional take on these genres. Not to mention a far more lighthearted one, with cartoonish visuals in the vein of a classic European comic. Rainbow Moon tells the tale of a young warrior who falls through a portal into another realm and wants to get back home. It's fairly standard stuff. His quest sends him around the mysterious new land, interacting with the locals, completing tasks and quests, and of course killing an awful lot of monsters. It's a frequently challenging game that subscribes to the old-school philosophy of making each new area you venture into seem almost unbearably difficult until you level up a bit and develop the strength and endurance to face the bad guys on equal terms. In the early going, Rainbow Moon is simply a contest to prevent your solo hero from being overwhelmed by the many bad guys. Once you begin recruiting additional party members, the friction instead comes from trying to balance character growth and resources among your entire team. Rainbow Moon uses an unconventional skill system in which you don't earn simple experience points from your victories. Rather, defeated enemies drop pearls, which you can exchange at certain shops in order to boost individual stats. Each character's stat upgrades have different costs, which is to say one character may be able to upgrade their strength stat for 6 pearls per level, while a physically weaker character's strength boost costs 15 pearls per pop. It's an interesting way to make universal growth options available for all characters, while encouraging players to specialize differently with each hero. Rainbow Moon's take on role-playing combat drifts spiritually in a similar direction to Deadline's. Although the two games could hardly look or feel any less alike, both liven up their turn-based battle mechanics by presenting combat through a tactical lens. Where Deadline's cover-based gunplay straddles a line between turn-based and real-time strategy that calls to mind the likes of Fallout, Rainbow Moon is reminiscent of games like Disgaea, or maybe the likes of SSI's old gold box Dungeons and Dragons adventures. Engagements lack the height factors and directional facings of a proper tactical RPG, but movements and enemy proximity are essential considerations in Rainbow Moon's battles. Each character, ally and enemy alike, has a set number of actions to spend per turn. Initially one, but eventually sub-turns open up to allow multiple actions per turn. These actions can be spent as either attacks, movements, or defense. Each battlefield is presented from an isometric perspective and divided into a grid of squares, and each combatant can move one space per turn or subturn. This gives battles greater strategic depth than simply lining up and taking turns each other as in standard RPG combat systems. And it opens up the possibility of more advanced gambits, such as luring enemies away from one another or positioning your characters in between loop drops from fallen bad guys, which prevent foes from occupying a given space. Positioning also matters in terms of your team's attack capabilities. Melee fighters can only attack enemies in adjacent spaces, while ranged fighters can use distance attacks. Managing your team's weaknesses and capabilities while skirmishing with half a dozen monsters can be a real test of critical thinking, especially when you begin to factor in details like character speed, which determines how frequently each combatant can move. With enough of a speed advantage, a fighter's 2 subturns can effectively turn into 4 actions before their opponents move, which is awesome when it's your team getting the combat perks, less so when those perks are being used against you. Another major factor in combat is that combatants only earn those precious experience pearls when they're the ones to strike the killing blow. Simply taking part in combat doesn't mean a given character will be able to level up their stats. They have to claim the kill first. This means there's no advantage to always steamrolling the bad guys with your mightiest warrior, since that simply means your strong characters get strong while the weak ones languish behind. Although Rainbow Moon is a fairly small game compared to your typical modern RPG, and its story is fairly rote, its combat has a just one more round sort of appeal that keeps you engaged. While not exactly a dungeon crawler, it definitely calls to mind the addictive nature of that genre. All in all, a solid and memorable entry in the limited run pantheon for both PlayStation 4 and Vita.